Hello again, and welcome to another podcast. So this is Graham Elliott from Salescraft Training. Now, what I want to talk about today is a leadership problem that I don't think gets enough attention, but it's something that affects us every day, particularly salespeople, because I think this is an essential element of good salespeople, and that is, how do you lead people when they don't actually report to you? So most of us tend to associate leadership with job titles, with seniority, with authority. But the reality is that many people are expected to influence outcomes without having any formal control. And obviously, I'm sure you can think of numerous examples. So project managers coordinating with people from different departments would be a good example. HR professionals trying to influence managers, subject matter experts whose knowledge goes beyond their formal authority, and anyone trying to create change from the middle of an organization. But obviously the most relevant example for us as salespeople is how we influence not only our clients, but how do we also influence internal teams to support clients? So depending on the kind of environment you're in and what you're selling, you may or may not rely on the support of internal teams, but I've certainly been in that situation when I was making complex sales. So I'd be selling systems. I needed engineering people involved. I needed local service people involved. But also when I wasn't doing that, there might be other things. There might be accounting people. The accountant might need to know if they've got to get a lot of foreign currency in. So that will obviously impact timelines. So if you're expecting an order in, but it involves some money going up front to your supplier, for example, then whoever's managing the cash flow of your business really needs to have a good idea of what's happening, particularly if it's a relatively large amount, so that they can do their job. So leadership definitely goes beyond the title, and it becomes really interesting when nobody's actually obliged to follow you. So what are the things maybe as salespeople we should be thinking about that might help us to do our job a little bit better? So let's look at the difference between authority and influence. So authority is essentially people doing something because somebody in a position of authority over them has told them to do it. So that might be a manager or a director or somebody if you report directly to them. It could also be a police, somebody like that. If you're pulled over and they have authority given to them by the law to give you lawful commands, that sort of thing. So in those situations, it's very, very clear. Generally, you're expected to do what you're told to do. It's very, very simple, and that's authority. So what's influence? Well, that's when people do something, but they do it because they trust, they respect, or they believe in what you're trying to achieve. So obviously what's required to have somebody do what you would like them to do is very different when you compare the situation of somebody in authority giving an instruction against somebody who has no authority but is trying to influence the outcomes. So influence is really important, and it's a really, really valuable skill set to develop. And obviously, in order to develop it, you need to understand what it is and what are the essential elements. So there's a few points here. So one of them is, does having authority automatically make someone a leader? And I would suggest no, because I'm sure we've all worked for bad managers. I've certainly had my share of them, and they're people where I'm thinking as I'm speaking here, but an example I can think of is an environment I worked in, and not for very long. I got another job very quickly, but it was where as salespeople, we were in a situation where we almost had to have we need to be looking at over one of our shoulders to make sure our sales manager wasn't about to stab us in the back. He was that kind of a person. And I remember he told the internal salespeople not to tell any of us if we'd received an order, if an order had come in from one of our clients, unless we specifically asked. I mean, that to me is just insane. It's a ridiculous kind of environment to expect people to work in. But there are managers out there who think that this is how you manage. And often, in my opinion, that's down to somebody who's probably a weak manager and needs to feel in control, needs to have a sense of authority. And they do that by bullying or making life difficult for the people who are forced to report to them. So that, to me, yeah, it's somebody in authority, but they're most definitely not a leader. Would you choose to be with them? Absolutely not. And this is a great example, and I'm sure you've got them, of somebody who has plenty of authority, but they have very little influence. You're only doing what they say because you don't have much of a choice. And I certainly was one of those people who wasn't prepared to stick around in that environment. I just got a job as soon as I could somewhere else. Conversely, though, there are other people in the organization that everyone listens to, regardless of their job title. So, again, the important thing to consider here is why informal leaders can sometimes have far more impact than senior managers. And I've shared a story with you of at least a bad manager. And I like to feel that as a salesman, and certainly in a major account I was running, we actually had quite a tight schedule. We had a major system coming in. So I was in the UK, but the products were made in Japan. And it was a really big deal, major order. It's the biggest order I got at that company. But there was a conflict with when the client needed the delivery, and when the supplier was actually able to deliver, the supplier could not make the delivery that the customer needed. And so I worked out some compromises, and one of them was doing a final test, which would normally happen at the factory, but I persuaded them to actually do that on site once the kit was delivered, which meant we could actually get the delivery done. But I needed local service people to be prepared to, it was actually Northern Ireland, so it meant, a flight away from where they lived in southern England. And the way to get that done was to essentially work with people. I would hold monthly meetings or as needed with the people who were involved, which also included accounts as well, because they were managing cash flow. And I just kept them informed of where things were at, where I felt there might be an issue or a conflict, to look at ways of getting around that. Could we put the resources in place when we needed them? Usually you'll guarantee things are going to happen on a weekend when people don't want to be working. That's just the nature of it. So I guess my point for you is that if you are in a situation like that where you need to influence people, what can you do to make your life and their lives much easier? How can you begin to influence people to get the outcome that you need? So this is one aspect of it. And another thing to be aware of is there is a frustration of being responsible when you're not in control. So that, again, is a very difficult situation where you're accountable, let's say, for delivering an outcome. So in my case, it was getting this delivery to a client from a manufacturer who basically told me they couldn't make the delivery. And frankly, I said to them, well, do you want the business or not? Because if you want the business, you're going to have to find a way to help us to make it happen. So I was responsible in that situation for a particular outcome, but I was totally dependent on other people. I basically had no authority. There was very little I could actually do. If everybody said no, then that was that, it was gone. So the kind of questions, if you're in that sort of situation, is to, particularly if you're frustrated by it, is to ask, why is the situation so frustrating? Also think about what happens when people try to compensate for being frustrated by becoming more forceful. What that generally is likely to do, if you start pushing, is that other people will push back. And that's just how people tend to interact. If one person starts pushing, if you've got other people here who also have their own authority issues, they're likely to push back. So it's really important to find a way that is non-confrontational, where you avoid conflict. And there can be a temptation to act as though you have authority that you don't actually have. I would let that one go if that's something that you tend to do. And of course, another potential issue with when you're misusing influence, it becomes manipulation, it becomes political maneuvering, it becomes something that is trying to meet an objective, but in a very unhelpful way, in a very unhealthy way. And what I mean by that is that it's unhealthy because it sets you up for failure. Rather than strengthening the relationship you have with the people who you're working with, you're actually undermining that relationship and you're weakening it. And if you push too much, what can happen is that the people you're working with will take delight in watching you fail because you've just pushed too hard. So there are definitely situations where if you're uncomfortable, you have to find another way of making things happen. If you're feeling frustrated because you don't have control, your only real choice here is to find ways of working with the people who do have control and encouraging them, influencing them to the outcome that you're trying to get to. So that takes us to a really important thing to think about, which is what makes people choose to follow you. So what are the things that make you choose to follow somebody else? Maybe someone who has no direct authority over you, but you really want to help them anyway. Or even if it's not even a work relationship, if it's just a personal relationship, but it's somebody that you'll go out of your way to help because that's what you want to do. So what are the kind of things that you think about? So it could be credibility, it could be the strength of relationship, it could be the trust that you've built up, it could be understanding what matters to the other person. That's a really important one, particularly salespeople, because that's essentially what we're doing anyway when we're working with clients, is understanding what is important to them, what is the thing that we have to deliver. And then we have consistency. So again, this comes down to trust. What makes you trust people? And one of those factors, I would say, is consistency. Do they say what they say? Do they do what they say they're going to do? Are they reliable? Can you trust them to deliver when they say they're going to deliver? So that kind of thing, again, is really important in terms of influence, because you need to be solid, you need to be reliable, you need to be as good as your word, and you need to be consistent with that. Are you someone who contributes rather than just makes demands? Are you willing to compromise? Are you willing to negotiate? Are you willing to find a middle ground, whatever it takes to get it done? And another important thing is having compelling reasons for people to get behind an idea. Again, what motivates people? How can you, when you're getting them to support you in getting an outcome, how can you motivate them so that they feel good about what they're doing, not only because it's helping you, because you built up that trust, but they take a pride in what they're doing as well. So these are themes primarily. I can't really dive into these too much, partly because of the length of the podcast and also because it does depend on certain situations. So all of those things are important things, and hopefully one or two of them have jumped out at you as things that you could perhaps pick up and develop and work with to improve your own ability to get things done, either in your organization or with your clients or both. And another important thing to remember is there is a danger of confusing agreement with commitment. So if people say, yeah, that sounds good, or I'll look into it, or absolutely leave it with me, quite often you'll get a situation where nothing happens. And obviously, again, in the sales environment, we get that all the time. You know, clients will often say that as a way of just getting rid of us, and then they disappear. So as salespeople, this is a skill hopefully you've already developed. And it's that skill set that allows you to separate someone being polite with actually having buy-in. It's the difference between somebody agreeing with an idea and then, or actually being committed to helping it to happen. And it's also why leaders without authority need to become good at recognizing genuine commitment. And this is really important. It's a very important skill for salespeople to develop, because I'm sure we've all had that situation where we thought a sale was happening. We were really confident about it. We're getting all the right noises from the client, and then nothing happens. and suddenly everything goes quiet. We forecast it. Maybe we've even got other people ready to go. And then we find out that a competitor has actually gone and got the business. So these are skills that we're using every day when we're working with our clients. But these are really fundamental skills when it's working with people in our own organization to make sure that things happen when we need them to. So I want to, I guess, sort of throw out questions really, and these might be questions that are worth discussing at some future point in a future podcast. And if they are, just let me know. By all means, drop a comment, send me an email to say that there are things that maybe that got your interest, and maybe you'd like a theme to be developed a little bit more, or maybe you'd even like to come on the podcast and have a chat about it. So whatever, we can do all of those things. So I guess I'm going to leave these as open questions for you, but they're really important things to think about, because if you don't have an answer to these, then they're worth considering. So what do you do when somebody simply won't cooperate? That's the first one. When should you persist, or when should you back off? When should you escalate an issue? When do you accept that not every battle is worth fighting? And can trying too hard to influence someone actually damage the relationship? So where is that point in the relationship where you can push, you can try to influence someone, but you then realize that that's it. Going any further will not have the outcome that you want. So there's no simple answer to these, by the way. These are questions to bear in mind, and maybe to ask regularly when you are in situations where things are not quite coming together. They're not quite working the way you'd like them to. And I suppose just to finish things off, I'd like to suggest that you may have more influence than you think. And this really comes back to where I started, and that it is that leadership isn't confined to people with management titles. And I would argue that there's a lot of people with management titles who are not leaders. They don't know how to lead. Every organization has people who influence how others think and behave, and they're not necessarily the people with management titles. Now, formal authority can make compliance easier because I guess as a society, we're sort of, I'm not sure programmed is the right word, but we are certainly brought up to recognize authority to one degree or another. Even if we push back against it, we recognize it. So formal authority can make compliance easier, but voluntary commitment is something quite different. And that is a real skill to develop. And as salespeople, I think it's a really important skill for us to develop. And I suppose a thought to leave you with is just to say that perhaps the real test of leadership isn't what happens when people have to listen to you. It's what happens when they don't. So basically when they have choice. And the final thing I'm going to leave you with today is just to maybe have you think about, who do you influence? Who are the people that you're influencing? Who influences you? Are you relying too heavily on your position, particularly if you have a management title? And where can you lead even if nobody's officially giving you permission to lead? What are the situations? Where are those situations where you can take up leadership? So these are really thoughts, I suppose, that I'm not really teaching outcomes or anything like that, but I think they're good talking points. I think it is really important to understand that those of us in sales are in a role where leadership is required, but it's leadership without authority for most of what we do. And once you understand that, and you understand the difference between leadership and authority, influence and authority, that's where I think you can really develop the skill set you need to influence people and get them to buy in and want to go along and want to produce the outcome that you're trying to guide them to. So I hope you found that interesting. Hopefully that's a useful way to start your week if you're listening to this on Monday when it comes out. and have a great week. And I'll speak to you again on Monday. So bye for now.